The film starts in a movie theater where a kid named Carl is watching a documentary about an adventurer named Charles who had just finished his tour of the world, which included a visit to Paradise Falls in South America. After coming back to America, he showed the world the skeleton of an animal he saw in that mythical place. While the world was praising him, the scientists claimed that the skeleton was fake and called Charles a fraud. So we decided to visit Paradise Falls once again and bring back a living specimen of the strange animal to redeem himself. Carl's greatly inspired by Charles and spends his days dreaming to become an adventurer. One evening, while running around his neighborhood, he hears someone talking about Charles inside an abandoned house. Inside, he finds a little girl named Ellie having fun pretending to be an adventurer as well. And after noticing Carl, she recruits him to be her partner. The very same evening, she asks Carl to cross a shabby bridge and get back to his balloon. However, Carl ends up falling down and has to pay a visit to the hospital. After coming back home with a broken arm, he's reading something when out of nowhere, Ellie comes into his room to show him her adventure book, which contains pictures of Paradise Falls. She wants to visit that place at least once in her life, and she makes Carl promise that he will take her there someday. After she goes right out of the window, Carl stands there in awe since he's fallen in love with her. Years later, they end up getting married in a beautiful ceremony. They move into the decrepit-looking house where they used to play, and after working hard, they turn it into their dream home. Their married life is going great, but it doesn't last as Ellie learns that she cannot have children. She's heartbroken, but Carl cheers her up by showing her the adventure book, and from that day on, the two of them start saving money to visit Paradise Falls. They are really determined about it, but every time something goes wrong and they have to take money out of this fund. Years go by, and now they are an old couple, but they still haven't lost their sense of adventure, and one evening, Carl decides to go for a picnic. Unfortunately, this is the day that Ellie gets sick. While in the hospital, she hands over her precious adventure book to her beloved husband, asking him to carry on her dream. But after she dies, Carl is heartbroken, and he shuts himself in his house. After a while, he wakes up one morning and after getting some breakfast, goes to sit out on his porch. By now, the whole neighborhood has been replaced by apartment buildings. While getting his mail, a construction worker asks him to sell his house at a ridiculous price, but Carl declines the offer before making fun of the owner of the construction company. Later that afternoon, he's watching a TV show when someone rings his doorbell. He opens the door to find a young Boy Scout named Russell standing in front of him. The kid offers to help him, but even after Carl declines, he stays there and eventually tells Carl that he has to help a senior citizen to get his last badge and become a senior scout. It's clear that this means a lot to Russell, so Carl asks the kid to help him catch an imaginary bird that lives 2 blocks away. After getting rid of the kid, Carl is just about to go inside when he gets mad at seeing a truck run over his mailbox. In his rage, he ends up hitting the construction worker in the head, even though the guy was just trying to help him out. As expected, this creates a scene, and Carl knows that he now has to lose his home. A few days later, he appears in court where he is declared a public menace and a police officer escorts him back to his home, saying that he has to move into a nursing facility the very next morning. That night, Carl is looking at Ellie's adventure book and he decides to keep his promise to her. The next day, when people from the nursing facility come to Carl's house to move his stuff, he asks them to wait. The men are wondering why Carl has so many gas cylinders in his yard, when suddenly thousands of balloons appear from the house and pull it from its very foundations. As the house flies away, people of the city are in shock, but Carl is extremely happy. Using makeshift sails, he steers the house towards Paradise Falls, then sits down to get some rest. He's about to fall asleep when he hears someone knocking at the door. Confused by this, Carl opens the door to find Russell on his porch. Carl hesitantly lets the kid in, but Russell immediately starts touching things around his house and causes the entire house to shake after messing with the steering system. Carl turns off his hearing aid and starts cutting down some balloons to lower the house, when suddenly he hears a bang. He turns around to see a giant storm right in front of them, and he tries to steer his house away from it, but they get sucked in. Carl is doing everything he can to keep his precious things from breaking apart while his house is getting thrashed by the storm. When he wakes up a few hours later, Russell tells him that he steered the house all the way up to Paradise Falls. He even tries to show Carl the GPS that he used to navigate, but ends up throwing it out of the window. Carl doesn't believe him, so he starts to lower the house by cutting off some balloons, and suddenly they can see giant rock formations as they go through dense fog. They eventually hit the ground, and Carl falls out of the house, but he manages to hold on to the garden hose. However, he is getting dragged towards a cliff, and Russell has to help him keep the house from flying away. Just then, a strong wind blows away all the fog, and this is when Carl finds out that he's standing pretty close to the legendary Paradise Falls. But he can't get back inside the house, so he has to pull it towards the falls, and Russell agrees to help him in this difficult mission so that he can earn the Elderly Badge. While they're busy pulling the house, some dogs are chasing a strange-looking bird in the nearby forest. They have to stop their pursuit when Carl's hearing aid messes with them. Carl, on the other hand, has to take a break because Russell wants to relieve himself. When the kid finishes taking a leak, he sees some tracks. He's following them when he comes across a strange bird that seems to love chocolate. When Russell walks back to the house, Carl is scared to see the giant bird following him. However, the bird likes the kid even though he doesn't get along well with Carl. As they begin walking again, the bird follows them, but this is when Carl hears someone speaking. He follows the voice and comes across a dog named Doug, who, to their absolute surprise, can talk. Doug says his master made special collars that allow him to speak, and he has to bring the bird back to his master. Carl is amazed by all of this, but he can't waste any time, so he continues pulling his house to the falls. Meanwhile, the other dogs are still looking for the bird, and they are being led by a dog named Alpha. He's the one who sent Doug to look for the bird on his own, and he's over the moon after learning that Doug actually tracked down the target. He locates Doug using his collar and goes after him to get the bird. Meanwhile, Carl, who's oblivious to the incoming danger, is getting mad at both animals since they are slowing him down. After sending them away using some chocolate and the tennis ball on his cane, he makes a run for it through the dense forest. He even climbs a small hill hoping to get away from the animals, but to his disappointment, they are still right behind him. Carl and Russell spend that night hiding from the rain under the house. Carl notices that Russell can't even build a tent, and this is when he learns that the kid has been abandoned by his dad. Carl feels for the kid after he realizes that he is trying to win the final badge so his dad might come to attend his ceremony. The next morning, they wake up to find the bird going through their food on top of the house. Its children are calling for it, so it decides to leave Carl and Russell behind and go back to its home. However, something is blocking its path, so it hides. Russell, on the other hand, is moping around after losing his pet bird when suddenly Alpha and two other dogs surround them. They are angry at Doug for letting the bird go and decide to take these intruders back to their master. While walking through a narrow canyon, Carl notices even more dogs and all of them surround him and Russell outside a cave. But just before they attack them, an old man appears from the cave and asks them to stand down. Carl immediately recognizes the old man as none other than his idol Charles, and he runs to say hi. Charles is amused by Carl's reasoning for coming there using balloons, and he asks the two of them to stay for dinner. Carl happily accepts the offer and boards Charles's airship after tying down his house. Inside the ship, Charles shows them his collection of exotic animals, which amaze both Carl and Russell. Charles is talking about his adventures when a dog pours them drinks and another one announces that the dinner is ready. So Carl joins his childhood hero for this dinner and mentions how his wife would have been thrilled to be there. Charles tells them that he has to stay there until he captures the bird, which rarely comes out of its hiding spot. He then starts talking about how much he hates the people who come here to steal the bird, and this is when Russell blurts out that he made the bird follow him using chocolate. This gets Charles's attention, and he starts suspecting that Carl might also be trying to hunt the bird. He shows Carl the helmets of all the people who tried to steal the bird before asking him to stay for dessert. Carl knows they're in trouble, and he's trying to leave the ship when suddenly the bird screams and Charles spots him on top of the house. He then sees the intruders running away and sets his dogs after them. Doug asks Carl and Russell to escape through a cave, but they are too slow. Luckily, the bird saves them by picking them up and hauling ass out of there. They jump across rock formations, and when they hit a dead end, the house drags them across the ravine. Unfortunately, before falling down, Alpha bites the bird's leg, and Russell is sad to see that the bird can't even stand up. They can hear its babies calling for it, and Russell asks Carl if they can help the bird get to its home. Carl knows the balloons are running out of helium, but he can't leave the poor animal behind. While he's thinking about what to do, Charles learns from his dogs that Doug is helping the intruders, so he uses Doug's collar to locate him. Meanwhile, Carl and Russell are taking the bird back to its children, and on their way, Russell mentions how his favorite memories are the little things he used to do with his dad. Carl is thinking about the kids' words when they spot the little birds and their mommy starts hobbling towards them. This reunion gets interrupted when Charles shows up there on his ship and traps the bird in a net. Carl is trying to cut down the net when Charles sets his house on fire. The house has too much sentimental value for the old man, and he runs to put out the fire. Meanwhile, Charles and his dogs grab the bird and fly out of there. When Carl finally puts out the fire, Russell is mad at him for prioritizing his house over the poor bird. But Carl gets mad, saying that he didn't want to be in this mess in the first place. He even blames Doug for all of this. After letting off some steam, he once again starts pulling his house and somehow manages to get it all the way to the mythical waterfall. But before he can even celebrate, Russell shows his disappointment by throwing away his belt. Carl picks it up and takes it inside his home, where he sits down in his favorite chair. He then opens Ellie's book once again, and this is when he notices some pictures he never saw before. It turns out his wife had cataloged her entire life, calling it a beautiful adventure, and at the end of it she asks Carl to find his own adventure. Her words resonate with Carl, who goes to talk to Russell, but the kid is already leaving to save his friend. Carl decides to follow him, so he starts throwing away all of his stuff until his house starts floating again. He's steering it when someone knocks at the door, and this time it's Doug. Carl finally accepts the dog as his pet and gets a big hug in return. While he's making up with Doug, Russell catches up to the airship and boards it through a window. However, he instantly gets caught and Charles decides to throw him out after noticing Carl is following him. Carl, on the other hand, is getting ready to board the ship when he sees Russell slipping from a platform. He immediately makes his way to the airship and saves Russell before putting him back inside the house. He then goes into the ship with Doug, who takes him straight to the bird through a secret passage. However, many dogs are guarding the room. This is when Carl spots Doug playing with the tennis balls. He uses the ball to distract the dogs and lock them out. While he's freeing the bird, Russell falls out of the house and ends up hanging from the garden hose. Charles sees him and sends out his dogs, who start shooting tranquilizer darts at the kid. He then confronts Carl, who gets separated from Doug. While Doug gets chased by the other dogs, the two old men are trying to duke it out. Carl is about to get stabbed when Doug accidentally shakes the ship. This allows Carl and the bird to get out through a window, but Charles is still after them. Back on the ship, Doug traps Alpha and ends up becoming the leader of the dogs. Russell also decides to climb after hearing Carl's call for help. He takes out the fighter planes by distracting the dogs. He then goes to pick up Carl and the others from the top of the airship, but just then, Charles shoots down the balloons and the house falls down. Carl tries to stop it, but Charles is going into the house to kill the bird. This is when Carl asks everyone to grab the bird before showing it a bar of chocolate. As expected, the bird runs to grab it while the house and Charles both fall down. Carl, however, is relieved to see the kid and the animals hanging from the hose. As he watches his home fly away, he realizes that it's just a house and nothing more. They take the bird back to its home, and after it goes away with its children, Carl takes Russell to his scout ceremony, where he's awarded the elderly badge. Unfortunately, his father doesn't show up, but Carl steps up and gives him the badge that Ellie gave him all those years ago. Later on, they all get some ice cream and play the same car watching game that Russell used to play with his dad. And while they're having fun, Carl's house is once again sitting on top of Paradise Falls, exactly where it's supposed to be. If you enjoyed that recap, I got a good feeling you'll enjoy this one too. Click on the video on your screen for more.